Pulavinaka and welcome to For the Record. Fiji, along with the rest of the world, is marking 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Tonight we're going to look at how the media portrays gender issues, gender violence and issues surrounding the treatment of people who don't identify as either male or female. Our guest tonight is the chair of the Media Development Authority, Mr. Ashwin Raj. Ashwin, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Just to kick off discussions, I'd like to get a feel from the Media Development Authority on what the authority believes the state of play is with regards to reporting gender violence in Fiji. Are we doing a good job of it? Are we on the right track? And where are we failing?
Thanks for having me on your show, Edwin. I think the first thing that I'd like to say is that given the surge in incidences of violence and the reporting around it, one of the things that we took full cognizance of was the numerous sort of complaints that we received from members of the public about the ways in which the media was treating these reports of violence, and of course the first thing of concern to us was basically sort of the identification of the victims of violence and the focus on the gory details, the glorification of violence, and of course our concern is that that kind of focus on glorification of violence actually normalizes practices of violence to an extent that things become salacious, and of course people kind of think this makes a good titillating read without necessarily realizing that this further incriminates victims of violence, diminishes their sense of dignity, and also obstructs the work of the purveyors of law in properly doing their work, because there are huge jurisdictional implications for the work that is being done and how the media actually goes about reporting it. And for us, the concern is whether certain laws have been transgressed. So, for instance, if you look at the Media Industry Development Decree, it has very, very specific provisions around violence, around sexuality. If you look at Section 8 and Section 24 of the Media Industry Development Decree 2010, it specifically talks about things like not to identify victims of violence, not to identify children in particular if they're witnesses, and not to identify victims of violence even if the law permits you to. And there's a good reason why. It also talks about prolonged focus on sexual-based violence and sexuality in the media and the impact that can have, the effect of titillation, so on and so forth. And so I think that it's imperative that the media takes full cognizance of these provisions in the decree. So when we did receive complaints from the police and complaints from the Fiji Women's Crisis Center, together with members of the public, we took that very seriously, and we got in touch with the respective media, and we wanted to actually sort of then say that I don't think as a development authority we should be sitting and waiting for complaints to come. We should be a lot more proactive. And one of the things that we actually did was, in the lead up to the 16 days of activism, we had a major workshop in partnership with DFED on how the media can report responsibly on issues of violence.
It can't all be that bad, though. I mean, you started off by saying that there have been increased reports, and the media would also say that there have been increased reports. And given that these have to be reported, have you seen the media move with the times on a general scale? There may be times reports which don't follow the regulations, but in general, are we moving in the right direction?
The one thing that I can say is there's much more reporting now. So it's not simply the case that Fiji has sort of like an increase in the number of incidences of violence, but the reporting has increased for sure. And so I mean that's an important thing. And given the fact that if you look at our leaders, And even if you look at members of the civil society organizations, they've made a very, very solid case about the costs of violence. And in that sense, one of the things that's become very, very clear is that violence is not a personal issue. This is a national issue. And in that sense, given the role of the media in raising issues of national interest, it's absolutely important that the media does talk about it, does report on these things. But how the media goes about reporting it, that's the issue for me. In terms of following the protocols of responsible journalism, also bearing in mind the profound implications of that kind of report on the victims of violence, taking into cognizance the fact that we have to start thinking about the issue of consent if it is a child, because one of the things that happened with that very unfortunate incident, where the school student who was raped, and there are a series of stories, because one of the things that came out was that the nation needs to know, and there needs to be some degree of sort of accountability, and transparency and so on and so forth, and exposing transgressions that took place, plus also whether the police effectively did its work or not, so on and so forth. But at the same time, you have to bear in mind that there are certain protocols that the police have to follow, and they have their own set of rules, and I think the media needs to be fully aware of that, so that they are not obstructing the work of the police. Let them independently carry out their work, but at the same time, report by all means. But how you report responsibly is the issue. And thinking about the welfare of the victim. For instance, they identified the victim. There was, and I'm not going to name media, because this is not about putting them on trial here on this show, but really generally sort of what are the lessons we've learned, right? And identifying the school, identifying where the victim had moved, so on and so forth. In a way, like there's like a GPS, tracking device on the victim, which is a problem. It's further incriminating the victim. It's putting the victim on trial once again. And as you know, this is a very, very traumatic, experience, and nobody would want to put their children through that. So okay. I think that's the kind of thing the media needs to start thinking about.
Okay, and with that, we will take a break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show. We're speaking with the MIDA Chair, Ashwin Raj, about what role the media plays in gender violence and reporting gender issues as we mark 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Ashwin, where do we draw the line between responsible journalism and reporting an issue that needs to be brought out, that needs to become public discussion? Because, as you know, there's a lot of taboo around talking about rape, sexual abuse, physical abuse, domestic abuse, or even abuse in the workplace.
Right. Certain constituencies would actually put up the argument that the line of demarcation is quite blurry. But on the other hand, I don't think it's as blurry as people make it out to be, because I think, first of all, we must take a stance on the glorification of violence in the media. For instance, describing in great detail a particular sexual act. What purpose does it serve? So if you look at something like rape, it's an exercise and an abuse of power. Somebody who's in a preponderant position, who's is able to exercise that power over somebody who is powerless, right, has been subjected to that kind of violence. Now, for the media to then reproduce that act is to further subject that victim to violence. The question that I want to ask the media is, what purpose do gory details, serve? So we talk a lot about the violence of pornography, And I think that, we as a nation must also talk about the pornography of violence that takes the form of these kind of details, about particular kinds of sex acts. So does it lead to some kind of epistemic transformation? Does it lead to some kind of change of mindset, other than people just reading something and saying, oh, wow, And so, and I think the discourse needs to fundamentally shift from, mere titillation to asking deep questions about why people, act the way they do. Why do people feel the need to exercise power and abuse power, abuse their sense of trust? Where does structural violence come from? What do we understand by gender? What do we understand by violence? Is violence simply a physical act, or is violence, psychological? So I think the media can go well beyond sort of that kind of, very, very perfunctory account of, certain acts of transgression to say, somebody took somebody X to the bush and did A, B, C, which is what you normally, read, one of those compulsory paragraphs that, that has to be there. Instead of that, apply investigative journalism and start asking, deep, meaningful questions about, the nature of power relations, the rights of our children, how safe are they, and what are authorities doing, what kind of policies do we have in place, so on and so forth. And you'll begin to sort of kind of, see that the issue has to do with the aperture between the putative claims of law and what's happening on ground. You begin to investigate what is the role of the police, what is the role of other ideological apparatuses such as schools, what is the role of the teacher, so on and so forth. What are the rights of the child? What about the issue of consent? And you begin to delve deeper. You begin to deconstruct the nexus of power relations. You begin to look at the political economy behind violence, and you begin to sort of kind of think seriously about how society also constructs its own concepts of violence. What is a violation? And what is an enabling violation? And what kind of violence is within the permissible narrative? It's okay, let's not talk about this kind of thing. But that's a huge spectacularized sort of concept of violence, and we should be more concerned about that. So I think we need to start thinking about what the ratios are and how we perceive violence, and the genealogy of violence. Because for a lot of people, what we might consider as violence could be very, very normative. That's what they've lived with all their lives. And I think the media can play a huge part in deconstructing this stuff. But for this to happen, you need to have an educated media. A media that is sensitive to issues of gender, a media that is sensitive to issues of human rights, a media that begins to ask meaningful questions about violence and about the nexus between violence and gendering and how society is stratified.
You started, you brought the point about an educated media. Training has been held, which might facilitate it.
Yes.
Based on that, what sort of shortcomings have you identified, and how do you hope to address that in the future?
I mean, one of the fundamental things for us was how does one narrate? Because if you look at and I think this is the thing that in a lot of sort of kind of human rights circles, it's been increasingly recognized that the right to narrate is an important right. So one of the things that we've been asking the media is to start thinking about the issue of voice, and how do you narrate, and what are the ethical boundaries of narrating, and who's your locus of enunciation, from where are you speaking, right? And so we had like a couple of simulation type exercises around that. But I think that that's a very good start. But then you need to sort of kind of sustain that kind of frame of thinking. And one of the things that I've been asking, and this is a huge challenge, is whether media rooms have gender focal people who are actually trained in these issues. Because when you do have staff that undergo these kind of critical training, because of the fact that the turnover rate is so high, because of the fact that you don't have a number of people in your newsroom, everybody reports on everything else. So one of the difficulties with that is the ways in which the whole thing gets banalized. And so for me, it's important that newsrooms start thinking about the issue of gender. And issue of gender has got to do with a ton of things, including how are the newsrooms themselves gendered. What kind of roles and responsibilities do women reporters have? Remember the whole kerfuffle around skirt journalism and the place that women have in reporting issues of politics, to other kinds of sort of kind of masculine cultures that begin to permeate and shape our discourses, and that becomes the predominant frame through which society looks at things, because after all that's where the camera is focused. That's how the media is looking at things, and the public is looking through that frame as well. So I think that we need to deconstruct that frame. We need to look at the gendered nature of relations within the media. We need to start opening up the discussions around gender. One of the things we haven't done, of course, is start thinking about our Bill of Rights in our Constitution, because the Bill of Rights actually makes a reference to sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression.
That's something we're going to pick
It's a
on.
huge thing that we should talk about.
We will be talking about just that in our next segment. We have to take a break now. We'll be back shortly. Pulavanaka, and welcome back to the show. We're speaking with Ashwin Raj, the chair of the Media Industry Development Authority, about 16 days of activism against gender-based violence and what the media's role is in that aspect. Ashwin, before the break, you brought up the topic of gender recognition and gender identity. Fiji has a very active community, the LGBTIQ, which includes lesbians, gays, transgender, queers, and people who don't necessarily identify as male and or female. From a media perspective, as a journalist, I would say that in recent times, this community has been getting a lot of coverage, a lot of recognition in mainstream media coverage. Does MIDA believe that we are doing enough, though?
I mean, the proliferation of the images and the consciousness around sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression needs to be situated by this other kind of question: in what capacity? So a lot of times, if you look at the mainstream media, if you look at the cinema and so on and so forth, people from the LGBTI community, what I would call non-heteronormative subjects, non-straight sexual subjects, were normally seen as accessories to somebody's heterosexual lifestyle. So in a sense, they were there for comic relief, while straight people get on with their serious lives and so on and so forth. And that was to trivialize their presence. So they were there, but the question was in what capacity. And recent times you see a proliferation of this other kind of image about them being subjected to violence, harassment by institutions that have monopoly over violence, or when they're agitating for certain kinds of rights.
Sorry, what do you mean entities that have
monopoly over violence? So you'd be thinking about a whole host of institutions. For instance, the police, the military, and including schools and so on and so forth. And you see, and what we're looking at is institutions that have a certain kind of policing effect that go beyond the police themselves. You know what I mean? So in a sense, this other kind of proliferation of images has to do with that. But the question that I have is, to what extent are these reports actually done on their terms? How much agency do they have in these reports? How much institutionally validated agency do they have? In what capacity are they represented? And so, one of the things that that happened in the workshop was, somebody asked a member of the transgender community, so I mean, what do I call you, he or she, and they seem to be in that kind of bind.
But I mean, do you think that might be a genuine question from somebody who hasn't had the experience or the opportunity to have that interaction and to have that exposure?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Rather than presuming, the issue is of entering the protocols of the person about whom you're writing, rather than presuming. Because one of the things that happened was, and I recall because I'm very active in the LGBTI community, and one of the things that had happened was, there was a journalist who decided to coercively correct somebody's gender, to say, no, but I think she's really a he, and of course the discussion shifted so much from the times when they would think about non-heteronormative subjects as almost non-human, where people used to say it, and I remember those days, to now sort of this shifting of discussion to a much more sort of kind of nuanced human rights sort of kind of sensitive sort of language. But at the same time, I think a lot needs to be done once again in terms of narratives and the kinds of narratives that are put forward, and thinking through the fact that the violence that these communities are subjected to may not necessarily be the same kind of violence that we're thinking around heteronormative subjects. So we felt it's important that we work with these constituencies so that they have space and voice, and they're able to sort of kind of speak to the mainstream media about what their concerns are and how the media can best represent some of these issues, because what we need is an educated and an enlightened citizenry.
Well, I mean, I may be coming from a narrow perspective based on the FBC newsroom, but we do make an effort to seek these people out, to seek out the LGBTIQ community, and to do coverage, to do stories.
Sure.
We not just during the 16 days of activism, but at various intervals throughout the year as we go. We give them space for them to have their say, for them to be heard. But are you saying that the media isn't doing it in the right context?
How do I put this politely? There's the
Well,
issue.
You don't have to be polite about it.
No, but the issue is one of
frankly.
strategic essentialism. And I speak frankly all the time. The issue is one of strategic essentialism. You do not, pull out members of the non-heteronormative community and strategically use them because a certain event demands you to have a voice which is from that community. And that's the kind of identity politics, which can be very debilitating. But if you look at our constitution, if you look at other, our, sort of very, very progressive and salutary provisions in the constitution, particularly around, section 26 on the prohibited grounds of discrimination. Now, the thing that I'm trying to say is that we don't, strategically use these communities because it's convenient to our politics at the time. I'm not trying to incriminate the media. All I'm saying is that we should actively work towards opening up the space at all times, so that the media becomes an important, platform for a discursive polyphony of voices, a plurality of perspectives at all times. You know how when we were writing books very early on, and there used to be that one compulsory chapter on women, so that you could show that your book was gender sensitive. Now people are talking about mainstreaming. Now people are talking about embedding that kind of consciousness through and through, rather than simply doing a lip service to it. So I think that, Edwin, what I'm trying to say is that as far as representation is concerned, we need to start thinking about mainstreaming, embedding this consciousness through and through, rather than sort of if it is International Day Against Homophobia and Transphobia, and then you get your poster sort of queer to sort of do that interview. You know what I mean?
Yes, I get you, Ashwin. We'll take a break.
Sure.
We'll be right back. Good evening and welcome back to the show. We're speaking about what role the media plays in the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Ashwin, before the break, you were talking about how the media is opportunistic in its reporting of the LGBTIQ community. But you have to give recognition that it has moved quite rapidly and quite progressively in giving space to this community, which in previous years was ostracized and which in previous years was seen as the taboo topic which nobody should be talking about. So we are taking steps in the right direction.
Absolutely. I take that as a lugubrious consolation at this point because there are greater strides to be made. I'm saying that if you look at our laws, they're very progressive. If you look at our constitution, it's one of the best. It's got a strong Bill of Rights. What the media needs to do is we need to work towards materializing those aspirations. So, opening up the space so that there's a multitude of, subjectivities that we can talk about. There's a multitude of, actors. Fiji is full of diversity. And it need not necessarily be limited to, just one set of sexual subjects. The one thing that the media needs to recognize is that sexuality is not something which is static. It's not something which is frozen. Sexuality is coming into being. As long as we are alive, I can be 72 and rethink my sexual position, rethink my sexuality. Yeah, and so I think we need to realize that that's part of the democratic imagination. So one of the things the media needs to do is the media needs to really seriously start thinking about bodies, about sexuality, and how we as society have perceived and thought about bodies and sexualities over the time.
How do we make it mainstream? If it isn't mainstream already.
So it's a twofold thing. It's not simply about just focusing the camera more on that and doing an overdetermined kind of thing. It also has to do with changing society's attitude around this. So for instance, you go into the cinema, you still find, in an extreme sort of scene of sexual violence, people are giggling. And, I had to ask myself, why are people giggling? Because for a lot of people, it's quite a harrowing thing. And so, someone said to me, people giggle because we don't know how to deal with violence. It's too confronting. And so, got me thinking about how can the media, educate the public around some of these things so that we no longer snigger, we no longer feel uncomfortable. We start thinking about, the question of sexuality, the question of body, the question of consent, in much more sort of serious terms around issues of power, around issues of the law, so that we don't trivialize these things. If you look at bullying, for instance, Edwin, how does it all start? When somebody feels he or she can exercise that power over somebody else who's in an abject, position, and there are a whole bunch of other people looking and giggling and ignoring it, saying, non-issue, to an extent that, it builds up, and the person ends up, either taking his or her life, or, doing something that destroys their life, and only because we thought it was okay. And so there needs to be a lot of, sort of awareness, gender sensitization. We need to start seriously thinking about what our Bill of Rights is saying. The Constitution, for instance, talks about dignity. You see, it talks about freedom, it talks about human rights, it talks about dignity. In this country, we've talked a lot about human rights. We've talked a lot about freedom, but we don't talk as much about human dignity. And you can't think about rights without dignity. And when we think about the issue of violence, when we think about the issue of gender-based violence, at the core of it is extending dignity to others and recognizing the dignity of others, entering the protocols of other people, which is why you and I are having this discussion. And I think the issue around transgendered communities, the issue of victims of domestic violence, how do we recognize the dignity? How do we recognize the humanity in others? And I think that's where the media comes in. And
whatever you're describing it's critical, it's imperative, but it's
absolutely
not very easy, is it?
No, it's not. Because remember, these things are not easy. What people go through is not easy. So how do you humanize this stuff? I mean, there was a lot of discussion at the workshop about how, people seem to sort of kind of not get moved by statistics, that stories actually move people, and that stories, have the effect of humanizing, that there is a face behind this number. So I said, start interrogating. What do the statistics actually mean? There are a number of people behind the stats. There are institutions behind the stats. There's policy behind the stats. There are conventions behind the stats. So start to concatenate, and ask robust, sort of kind of, questions around what do these statistics actually mean? Is it normal? Is it okay? Should we rage against it? If so, why and how? And so, and what the part that the media can play, and I give you a very practical example. In this country, there's a lot of contestation in certain circles that has to do with a certain kind of confusion about what the law is and what the law ought to be, because it has to do with one's political disposition, ideological proclivities, so on and so forth. The media can play a huge part in simply educating the public in non-legalese terms, basically, saying, what does the crimes decree say? What does the domestic violence decree say? What is a bailable offense? What does the media, mean when it says, alleged, so on and so forth? Things that we take for granted, but it's so material. And I think that the media can play a huge part in educating the public about what the laws actually say. But to be able to do that, the media will have to unlearn its own prejudices, will have to sort of kind of immerse themselves in the body of law, read through the Constitution, read through the various sections of, the relevant decrees to say, okay, so I want to report on this issue.
What you're saying, if I can sort of summarize, sure, is the media is not the enemy of gender issues and gender violence issues, but is not living up to the responsibility the media has towards this issue. Is that the point you're making?
Yeah, and more so, all I'm saying is that the media, and let's think proleptically, the media can play a fundamental role in shifting the terms of the debate so that, society catches up with the progressive laws. And society, an enlightened society, can then actually, think about legal transformation, think about political transformation, think about social transformation. And the media is an important catalyst for that kind of discussion.
Ashwin, we have to take a break now. We'll be back shortly. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. We're talking about the media's role in reporting on gender violence as we mark 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. Our guest is the MIDA chair, Ashwin Raj. Ashwin, let's look at another aspect of the media and gender-based issues. For a while, we've been reporting about victims of gender violence, and I'm not just talking about male violence against females, I'm talking about the transgender and the LGBTIQ community. We have treated them as the vulnerable and the weak, which has not been an entirely inaccurate description of yeah, this community. Mm-hmm. But do you feel that we need to now, as an industry, as a media, move them from the vulnerable mm-hmm, sector into a more inclusive basket? I mean, from what you've been talking about all night about mainstreaming and giving them the coverage they deserve, do they still need to be treated or perceived and reported on as the vulnerable mm-hmm, and weak?
I think that this is an important point, because in a very fundamental sense, representation precedes reality. So there was a time when, like I said to you, genealogically, if you looked at, the LGBTI community, they were seen as comic relief elements. So you gave them a lot of, coverage around Andi Senikau and so on and so forth. And then, of course, came the HIV/AIDS paranoia. And that started to sort of kind of zone into that one particular community. And, it was like a time bomb ticking, And then, of course, this other thing around, everyday violence and the normalization of violence. And then, of course, the agitation for rights. I think the media needs to kind of, move with the times, to look at what's happening to these communities and how they're transmogrifying, how the rights language has changed dramatically, and how does one go about the issue of giving voice and space, and how do we write stories on their terms, and so that's the discussion that we need to have about the right to narrate, and that's an important discussion, which has to be situated by this other kind of question around agency. If stories are being written, in what capacity and on whose terms? So I think you're absolutely right. The media needs to move with the times, and generally sort of kind of raise consciousness too. You see, what's happening in Fiji and what's happening world over. So we need to start thinking comparatively as well, because you see, our imagination has to be worldly as well. So we can't sort of kind of go around, justifying certain things as saying, well, this is our culture. Media needs to start constructing and deconstructing the ways in which, culture operates, and whose culture, and why is that culture sort of legitimate, and so on and so forth. And so we need to start deconstructing these things and start thinking about other forms of cultures too, right? And how do they proliferate through the mainstream media? How do they become embedded in our consciousness? And so, when we think about violence, tradition and culture and some of these terms still play a huge part. What is the media doing in terms of questioning these cultures, asking where do these cultures come from, who are the authors of representation, and is the culture changing? What part does the media play in freezing these cultures in time and space?
Ashwin, with that, we've come to the end of our show tonight. Thank you very much for being on our show, and we hope to speak with you sometime again in the future.
Thanks for having me.
That was the show for this evening. Remember, if you have comments or questions, you can email us for the record at fbc.com.fj. We'll be back again next Sunday. Until then, from me, good night. Up next is Nemanindale Batiki with the My Say segment.